I thought I was taking control of my life, making a bold choice that would change everything, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. What started as a secret thrill quickly spiraled into a web of temptation, danger, and unexpected consequences. This is my story, raw, unfiltered, and completely anonymous. Stay with me, because you won't see the ending coming. I didn't wake up that morning planning to cross a line. That's the lie people expect you to tell, the one that makes everything sound accidental, like desire is a spill you clean up with an apology. But the truth is quieter and more dangerous. The truth is that I had been standing at that line for a long time, staring at it, convincing myself that looking wasn't the same as stepping forward. I knew exactly what I was doing the moment I chose not to turn back. I remember the air that morning, heavy, almost sticky, the kind that makes your thoughts slow and your body restless. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting my shirt, then undoing the top button, then fastening it again. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. That's what I told myself. But my hands kept moving, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing, checking a reflection that wasn't changing. It wasn't vanity, it was anticipation, and anticipation is how bold steps begin. She had entered my life quietly. No dramatic arrival, no instant spark you'd recognize from a movie. Just a conversation that lasted longer than it should have. A look held half a second too long. A laugh that stayed with me after I walked away. I won't describe her in detail. Not because I don't remember, I remember everything, but because anonymity is part of the promise I made to myself when I decided to speak. She was married, yes. So was I, once. That history matters, but not in the way people think. What matters is that she was seen. Not in the way men often look at women, not with hunger first, but with recognition. I saw the version of her that stayed quiet while the world made decisions for her. The version that smiled because it was easier than explaining herself. The version that had learned how to disappear in plain sight. And she saw me too. That was the real danger. We talked at first the way people do when they're still pretending nothing is happening. Safe topics. Polite curiosity. Shared annoyances. The kind of conversations that don't leave fingerprints. But beneath every word, there was a current, subtle and constant, pulling us somewhere neither of us named. I told myself I was just being kind. That listening wasn't betrayal. That interest wasn't intent. But my body knew better before my conscience caught up. There's a moment, and anyone who's lived this will recognize it, when your inner voice stops warning you and starts negotiating instead. That's when you're lost. That's when the rules don't disappear, they simply bend enough for you to slip through. The first time we were alone together, nothing happened. That's important. Because it proves how deliberate everything that followed really was. We sat across from each other, close enough to feel warmth but far enough to pretend distance. Our conversation drifted into quieter waters, not confessions yet, but hints of them. I noticed how she touched her wrist when she spoke about things she couldn't change. She noticed how my voice dropped when I stopped joking and started being honest. I thought about standing up. About creating space. About ending the moment before it grew teeth. Instead, I leaned forward. That was the step. Not physical. Not yet. But intention has weight. And once you move with it, the ground shifts under you whether you acknowledge it or not. I remember thinking, this is bold. Not reckless. Not wrong. Bold. As if courage and desire were interchangeable. As if wanting something deeply enough made it noble. That's how we justify the first lie. Her husband never entered the room, not literally, not metaphorically. He existed only as a concept, an idea we politely avoided, like furniture you know is there but choose not to look at. She never spoke badly about him. That, strangely, made it easier. There was no villain to blame, no broken home to excuse us. Just longing, and longing doesn't announce itself as destructive. It feels like honesty finally being allowed to breathe. When she looked at me then, truly looked, I felt something old stir inside me, something I had buried under responsibility, disappointment, and routine. I didn't feel young, I felt awake. People confuse those two things all the time. When our knees brushed accidentally, or so we claimed, neither of us apologized. That silence was louder than any confession could have been. It said, we know. It said, were choosing not to stop. Still, we didn't touch again. Bold steps aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet agreements made without words. Sometimes the decisions not to leave when you absolutely should. When we finally stood to go our separate ways, I felt the weight of what hadn't happened pressing heavier than what had. Possibility clung to me like a scent I couldn't wash off. I walked away knowing something irreversible had begun, even if no one else could see it yet. That night, alone, I replayed the moment again and again. Not the near touch, not the looks, but the choice. The conscious, sober awareness that I had stepped into something I would not be able to control forever. And instead of fear, I felt excitement. That's the part people don't like to hear. I slept deeply, like a man who believes he has earned something. When I woke up, the guilt came softly, like a knock I chose not to answer. I told myself I would set boundaries. That I would be careful. That I wouldn't let it go too far. But I had already gone far enough. Because the bold step wasn't leaning forward. It was deciding that whatever happened next would be worth it. The first secret doesn't feel like a secret at all. It feels reasonable. That's how it gets you. By the time chapter 2 began, nothing wrong had happened yet, at least not in a way that could be pointed at, photographed, or confessed in a single sentence. No undeniable act. No evidence. Just a shift. A quiet rearranging of priorities that no one else could see. I noticed it in the smallest ways first. How I checked my phone more often than necessary. How silence began to irritate me if it stretched too long. How her absence felt louder than anyone else's presence. We hadn't named what we were doing. Naming things gives them weight, and we were still pretending this was light, harmless, manageable. We spoke less like conspirators and more like people who believed they were simply being honest for the first time in a long while. That's another lie people tell themselves, that secrecy equals truth. The first message she sent after that day was simple. Casual. Something that didn't need a reply. I replied anyway, not immediately. I waited, because waiting felt responsible. But even while I waited, I knew I would answer. I was only delaying the inevitable to make myself feel disciplined. Her response came faster. That's when the rhythm started. Back and forth. Nothing incriminating. No words that couldn't be explained away if someone else read them. But tone matters more than content, and tone is impossible to deny when you feel it settle into your bones. We didn't talk about her marriage. Not directly. It existed like a locked door at the end of a hallway we both avoided walking down. Sometimes I wondered if ignoring it made me cruel. Other times, I told myself it was respect. The mind is generous when it wants permission. What we did talk about were the things no one ever asks once they assume you're settled. Regrets that hadn't faded with time. The strange loneliness. Sitting across from her again, I felt the difference immediately. Familiarity had replaced uncertainty. The tension hadn't faded, it had sharpened. There's something dangerous about being comfortable with someone you shouldn't want. She smiled when she saw me. Not the polite smile from before, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes without effort. That smile did more damage than any touch could have. We talked for hours. Not flirtation, not overtly. That would have been easier to control. What we shared instead was intimacy without permission. The kind that slips past your defenses because it feels earned. At one point, she lowered her voice and said, "I don't tell people these things." The way she said people made it clear that I was no longer included in that category. I should have drawn a line then. A real one, not a mental suggestion or a promise I wouldn't keep. I should have reminded her, and myself, of reality. Instead, I said, "You can tell me." That sentence became our first real secret. After that, secrecy stopped feeling like a consequence and started feeling like a bond. We weren't hiding because we were doing something wrong, we told ourselves. We were hiding because what we shared was fragile. Special. Ours. That's how secrecy turns seductive. I noticed how carefully she chose her words when she spoke about home. Not lies, just omissions. And I mirrored her. We both became experts at speaking around the truth without touching it. Still, nothing physical happened. But proximity changed. We sat closer. Our hands brushed more often, not accidentally anymore, but without acknowledgement. I became aware of her in ways that felt intimate without being explicit, the cadence of her breathing when she listened, the way her posture softened when she felt safe, the way silence between us felt full instead of awkward. When she stood to leave, there was a hesitation, just a moment, where neither of us moved. It would have been easy then. A step forward, a touch, something undeniable. Instead, she said my name quietly, like it meant something new now. That was worse, because desire without release doesn't fade. It deepens. It roots itself. Later that night, alone again, I realized I had started organizing my life around moments that included her. I wasn't reckless yet. I was careful, calculated, and that scared me more than impulse ever could. Careful people don't stumble into affairs. They build them. I told myself I was still in control. That this was still just conversation. That no one was being hurt because nothing had happened. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. Something had happened. A door had closed quietly behind us, and neither of us had reached back to open it. And once the first secret is shared, the second. By the time chapter 3 began, I had stopped pretending this was temporary. That illusion had worn thin, peeled away by repetition and familiarity. What remained was something heavier, not just desire anymore, but attachment. The kind you don't plan for and can't admit to without changing everything. Desire is easy to excuse. Attachment demands accountability. The shift didn't announce itself. It crept in disguised as concern, as curiosity, as the quiet need to know how her day went, not out of politeness, but because my own day felt unfinished without that knowledge. I noticed it the first time I felt disappointed when she was busy. That emotion startled me more than anything else we had done. Wanting someone's body is instinct. Wanting their attention feels personal. Dangerous. It blurs lines you didn't mean to blur. We were careful, or so we believed. Our meetings were planned but spaced, our messages thoughtful rather than frantic. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Inside me, everything had. I began measuring time differently. Moments without her felt long and dull. Moments with her passed too quickly, like borrowed hours I knew I'd have to repay with silence later. That imbalance fed something restless in me, something I had forgotten how to manage. We still hadn't crossed certain lines. That fact became both a comfort and a torment. Because restraint doesn't erase desire, it refines it. Every withheld gesture sharpened the next look. Every unspoken thought pressed harder against the inside of my chest. When we met again, there was no pretending neutrality anymore. The air between us felt charged before we even spoke. She sat closer without thinking. I angled toward her without realizing. Our bodies negotiated proximity while our mouths stayed cautious. She told me something personal that day, not dramatic, not scandalous, just real. A vulnerability she hadn't offered lightly. I listened the way you listen when you know trust is being handed to you carefully, like something that could shatter if dropped. When she finished, she exhaled and said, "I don't know why I told you that." I did, because secrecy had evolved into safety. That realization should have stopped me. Instead, it anchored me deeper. I reached out then, not impulsively, not urgently, and touched her hand. Just once. Light, deliberate, long enough to be intentional, short enough to be deniable. She didn't pull away. That moment mattered more than anything physical could have. It was permission, not just for touch, but for everything that followed. Still, we didn't rush. That's the part people misunderstand. Affairs aren't always reckless. Sometimes they are meticulous. Sometimes they are built slowly, brick by brick, with restraint masquerading as virtue. I began noticing details I had no right to know. The way her mood shifted when she talked about certain obligations. The pauses she took before answering questions about home. The way she chose her words carefully, not to deceive, but to protect something fragile inside herself. I felt a strange mix of tenderness and jealousy, jealousy without ownership, which is a uniquely painful thing. I had no claim, no rights, no place to demand anything. And yet, I wanted more. That contradiction gnawed at me. One evening, after we parted, I sat alone longer than usual, replaying our conversation. Not the words, the silences. The moments where something hovered just beneath the surface, unspoken but understood. I realized then that what I wanted wasn't just her presence. It was exclusivity, and that terrified me, because exclusivity without legitimacy creates tension that has nowhere to go. It turns inward, it warps, it demands decisions. I hadn't considered decisions yet. I was still living in the comfort of postponement, telling myself there was time, that clarity would come later, that things would reveal themselves naturally. They were revealing themselves, just not in the way I expected. She began to ask questions too. Gentle ones, curious ones, questions that weren't about logistics, but about me. My past, my disappointments, the parts of my life I had learned to summarize instead of explain. Answering her felt good, too good. That's how I knew desire had become complicated. It wasn't just about wanting her, it was about being known by her. And once someone knows you in that way, walking away stops being simple. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were both protecting her anonymity, her safety, her untouched public life, yet we were dismantling parts of ourselves in private. Still, she wasn't caught. Not once. That secrecy gave us courage. Too much of it, because when consequences don't arrive immediately, you start believing they won't arrive at all. I remember thinking, maybe this is what freedom feels like. I was wrong. Freedom doesn't make you afraid to lose something you were never meant to have. And I was starting to feel afraid. By the time chapter 4 began, silence had become labor. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the kind you choose because it feels safe or necessary. This silence was heavy, deliberate, exhausting. Every word left unsaid demanded effort. Every truth avoided required planning. I hadn't noticed when secrecy stopped feeling intimate and started feeling like maintenance. That's the cost no one warns you about. You don't just hide an affair, you manage it. I found myself rehearsing conversations before they happened, editing responses in my head, anticipating questions that might never be asked. I wasn't lying constantly, but I was always prepared to. That readiness alone changed something fundamental in me. She felt it too. Our conversations shifted, still warm, still close, but threaded now with tension. There were pauses that hadn't existed before, moments where we both hesitated, calculating risk. The ease we once shared hadn't vanished, but it had tightened, like a rope pulled too far. She never complained, not directly, but I saw it in the way she exhaled when we parted, in the way she sometimes went quiet mid-conversation, as if weighing whether honesty was worth the fallout it might cause. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to be careful with me. That was another lie waiting to be spoken. Because caution had become our survival strategy. We met less often, not because desire had faded, but because fear had grown smarter. Our encounters became shorter, more deliberate. We chose places with exits. We avoided routines. We learned how to look ordinary together. There's something deeply unsettling about practicing normalcy. It changes how you see yourself. I caught my reflection one evening, not physically, but internally, and realized I was living in compartments. One version of me existed in daylight, visible and predictable. Another came alive in fragments, fueled by stolen moments and suppressed longing. Neither version felt complete. The guilt arrived late, not the dramatic, overwhelming kind people imagine, no sleepless nights or sudden moral awakenings. It came quietly, like a dull ache behind the eyes. Persistent, easy to ignore until it wasn't. I began to feel it most when she spoke about her life beyond me. Not because she was unhappy, that would have been easier to rationalize, but because she was functioning. Living, maintaining a reality that I was now part of, even if only in the shadows. That realization stripped away one of my final excuses. We weren't escaping something broken. We were complicating something intact. She never asked me to change her situation. Never hinted at leaving. Never framed herself as trapped. That restraint made everything harder. It meant the responsibility rested fully with us, not circumstance. One evening, after a particularly quiet stretch between us, she said something that lingered long after the words faded. I don't regret this, she said. But I'm tired of pretending it doesn't affect me. Her honesty landed heavily, because it mirrored something I hadn't admitted out loud yet. I was tired too. Tired of carrying a version of myself that only existed in fragments. Tired of managing emotions that had nowhere legitimate to go. Tired of the constant calculation, what could be said, what had to be swallowed, what risks were acceptable. Still, we didn't stop. That's the part people struggle to understand. Awareness doesn't automatically lead to action. Sometimes it deepens paralysis. Knowing the cost doesn't make you braver, it makes you cautious in new ways. We adjusted instead. New rules, unspoken ones, less vulnerability shared, more distance maintained. We tried to contain what had already grown too large. It didn't work. Containment only intensified what we were denying. Every restrained impulse sharpened into longing. Every withheld truth made the next one heavier. I started to fear not exposure, that never came, but erosion. The slow wearing down of who I was becoming. The quiet realization that staying silent wasn't preserving anything, it was hollowing me out. And yet, when I imagined walking away, the loss felt unbearable. That contradiction lived inside me constantly. She remained uncaught, unquestioned, unsuspected, and somehow, that made everything worse. Because the absence of consequences removed the urgency to decide. It allowed us to linger in a space that was neither safe nor resolved. I thought silence was protecting us. But silence, I learned, has its own price. And chapter 4 was where I finally understood that no secret stays weightless forever, even when no one else knows it exists. By the time chapter 5 began, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Nothing dramatic was coming to end this for us. No confrontation, no discovery, no moment where everything collapsed loudly enough to force a decision. That responsibility belonged entirely to me. And that, more than anything, frightened me. We often imagine consequences arriving from the outside, a knock on the door, a message read by the wrong person, a truth dragged into the light. But sometimes, the most profound consequences unfold quietly, inside you, long before anyone else notices. I had changed, not suddenly, not in a way that could be traced to a single choice. But slowly, undeniably, the man I was before this began felt distant now, like someone I remembered fondly but no longer recognized fully. She sensed it too. There was a softness in her that had hardened just enough to protect her. Not bitterness, awareness. She had learned how to live with the contradiction of us without letting it consume her entirely. I envied that, because for me, the contradiction had begun to define everything. We met one last time without calling it that. No declarations, no ultimatums, just an unspoken understanding that something was shifting, whether we acknowledged it or not. The space between us felt different, not tense, not charged, but reflective. As if we were both looking at what we had built and finally seeing its shape clearly. She spoke first. I don't think this was a mistake, she said quietly. But I don't think it can stay the same either. Her words didn't hurt. They clarified. For the first time, I wasn't trying to argue with reality. I wasn't negotiating or delaying or pretending there was another version of this that would feel easier. I realized then that the bold step I thought I took at the beginning wasn't the real one. The real bold step was accepting what this had been, without trying to turn it into something else. I didn't ask her to leave her life. I didn't offer her a future I wasn't certain I could honor. And she didn't ask me to stay in a role that no longer fit. There was relief in that restraint. We talked about what we had learned instead of what we had lost. About how desire can awaken parts of you that responsibility puts to sleep. About how secrecy can feel like freedom until it starts to cost you pieces of yourself. She never apologized. Neither did I. Because regret wasn't the right word. What I felt was gratitude, complicated, bittersweet, heavy, for the way this experience had stripped me of illusion. It showed me the version of myself I could become if I stopped paying attention. And the version I still had time to choose. When we parted, there was no dramatic goodbye. No promises to stay in touch. No declarations of eternal significance. Just understanding. She remained anonymous, untouched by suspicion, her life intact, if subtly altered by what she now knew about herself. And I carried the story alone. That's why I'm telling it now. Not to glorify it, not to warn against it, but to be honest about what boldness can cost when it isn't guided by clarity. I thought I took a bold step. What happened next didn't ruin me. It changed me, and sometimes, that's the more permanent consequence. This story is shared for narrative and reflective purposes only. All characters and events are presented anonymously and are not intended to represent or promote infidelity or harmful behavior. The story explores personal choices, emotions, and consequences without judgment. Viewer discretion is advised. Some stories don't end with exposure. Some don't end with forgiveness. And some don't end with punishment. They end with understanding. What you've just heard isn't a celebration of betrayal or secrecy. It's a confession of how easily a single bold step, taken in silence, can reshape a life forever. No one was caught. No doors were broken down. Yet nothing remained the same. Because the most dangerous changes don't happen when the world finds out. They happen when you do. If this story made you uncomfortable, reflective, or quietly emotional, that means it did its job. These are the stories we don't usually tell out loud. The ones that live in shadows, choices, and consequences that never make headlines. And there are many more like this. If you believe stories should be honest, raw, and unafraid to explore the parts of human nature we rarely admit. If you value narratives that don't judge, but reveal. If you want more confessions, real emotions, and unforgettable experiences. Right finger subscribe to this channel now. Right finger like this video to help others find stories that matter. Right finger share it with someone who understands that life isn't always simple, and neither are we. New stories are coming. Deeper, darker, more real.